Have you ever seen a smile so smug it concealed a $71 million mistake? That's when I understood the most confident person in the boardroom is often the most dangerous. He thought he'd won. He thought I'd walk out that door in silence. But what he didn't know was that I never let anyone else write my fate. I didn't need to scream, didn't need violent revenge. I just let the truth speak for itself. And when it did, his empire crumbled in silence. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and I've spent the last 5 years building the backbone of Altaris Dynamics' most critical systems. 32 years old, MIT graduate, the only person in a company of 300 who truly understood the intricate dance of our infrastructure. But apparently, that wasn't enough for Derek Vaughn. The performance review meeting was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. sharp. I arrived at 9:25, laptop tucked under my arm, expecting the usual corporate theater. What I got instead was a masterclass in nepotism dressed up as leadership. Derek sat at the head of the conference table, his Armani suit crisp enough to cut glass, that practiced smile already plastered across his 27-year-old face, fresh from his MBA, freshly appointed as Chief Technology Officer, fresh out of ideas, but overflowing with his father's confidence. "Maya," he said, sliding a piece of paper across the mahogany table, "your bonus this quarter, $1,200. I stared at the number, then at him. My team had just delivered CloudPath Phoenix ahead of schedule, a $71 million infrastructure overhaul that would define Altaris' next decade. I'd pulled 16-hour days for 3 months straight, debugging code that his LinkedIn perfect new hires couldn't even read. "You lack fire," Derek continued, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled like he'd seen in some executive coaching video. "Leadership energy, the kind of dynamism we need moving forward." I watched his mouth move, forming words that meant nothing. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle's skyline stood indifferent to our little drama. The Space Needle pierced through morning fog, and I found myself thinking about structural integrity, about how buildings stand because every beam, every bolt, every wire serves its purpose. Remove the wrong one, and everything collapses. "I understand," I said, my voice steady as bedrock. Derek's smile widened. "I knew you would. You're smart, Maya, technical, but this is a people business now. We need leaders who can inspire, who can synergize across verticals." Synergize. There it was. The first red flag that Derek Vaughn had no idea what actually held his father's empire together. He saw the glossy surface but never bothered to look at the pipes underneath. "Your last day will be Friday," he added, almost as an afterthought. 2 weeks severance. Of course, we're not monsters. The meeting lasted exactly 15 minutes. Derek had another 3 lined up after mine. Surgical strikes on the old guard, making room for his hand-picked army of enthusiasm over expertise. As I gathered my laptop, he was already scrolling through his phone, probably updating his LinkedIn about driving organizational transformation. Walking back to my desk, I felt something crack inside me. Not break, crack, like ice forming fracture lines before the thaw. My colleagues avoided eye contact. The news had already spread through Slack whispers and bathroom conversations. Tina from QA caught my eye, her face a mixture of sympathy and fear. She'd be next, probably. Anyone who actually understood how things worked would be. I sat at my desk and opened the CloudPath Phoenix repository. 60,000 lines of code, 18 months of architecture, every critical decision documented with my digital signature. Derek thought he was cutting fat. He didn't realize he was severing arteries. That's when I remembered Clause 73C. The beauty of working late nights is that you learn things others miss. While Derek was networking at wine bars and posting motivational quotes, I was deep in the compliance documentation, understanding every legal nuance that protected our intellectual property. Clause 7.3c was buried on page 47 of our IP governance framework, a provision I'd insisted on 18 months ago when I first architected CloudPath Phoenix. It read simply, "Any deployment, modification, or commercial utilization of proprietary system architecture requires explicit written authorization from the original author of record. I was the original author of record. That Tuesday night, while the office lay empty except for the cleaning crew, I methodically documented everything. The logic tree I'd created wasn't just code. It was a proprietary methodology for data migration that I'd developed over 2 years. Every function, every algorithm, every elegant solution to problems Derek couldn't even pronounce correctly. I pulled the Git history, showing my commits, my architectural decisions, my digital fingerprints on every critical component. The migration protocol alone was worth millions. It could move petabytes of data without a second of downtime, juggling live transactions while restructuring the entire backend. I'd written the core engine from scratch, a beautiful piece of engineering that Derek had called just some technical stuff in his last all-hands meeting. I printed everything, 76 pages of documentation, timestamps, commit histories, and most importantly, the original registration of the IP under my name, as per company policy for individual innovations. Human Resources had signed off on it. Legal had stamped it. Even Derek's father had initialed it, back when he still paid attention to details. At 11:45 p.m., I walked to Carl Dawson's office. Carl was our chief architect, a 60-year-old veteran who'd built systems before Derek was born. He worked late, too. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't sleep knowing amateurs were about to destroy 2 decades of his work. "Maya," he said without looking up from his monitor, "heard about this morning." I placed the binder on his desk. Page 47. Carl flipped to it, his reading glasses catching the blue light from his screen. I watched his expression change as he read, then reread the clause. His fingers traced the legal language, the signatures, the dates. He understood immediately. "You registered the entire migration protocol," he said slowly. "Every line. And Derek's planning to deploy without your authorization. Starting Monday." Carl leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't vindictive. Carl didn't do vindictive. It was the smile of someone who'd just seen a perfect checkmate 6 moves ahead. "You could have told him," he said. "He wouldn't have listened. He thinks the system runs on enthusiasm and synergy." Carl stood up, walked to his filing cabinet, and pulled out his own folder. "I've been documenting every decision, every shortcut, every ignored warning since Derek took over. Diana in compliance has been doing the same." Diana Hartwell, our compliance director, was another member of the old guard, methodical, precise, and absolutely ruthless when it came to regulatory requirements. She'd watched Derek's circus with the same quiet attention she gave to audit reports. "He has no idea. Does he?" Carl asked. "None. He's already announced the Phoenix deployment to the board, made promises to investors, set a launch date he can't possibly meet without my architecture. I secured the documentation in our legal repository, creating an immutable record with timestamp verification. Then I sent a single email to Diana, copying legal. Please confirm IP governance requirements for CloudPath Phoenix deployment, specifically regarding Clause 7.3c. Her response came at 12:23 a.m. Confirmed. No deployment without original author authorization. Violation would constitute IP theft and regulatory non-compliance. The trap was set, not through malice, but through precision. Derek wanted to play CEO fine, but he'd forgotten that in technology, the real power isn't in the corner office, it's in understanding how things actually work. Friday came faster than expected. I packed my desk at 4 p.m., taking only personal items, a succulent Tina had given me, my MIT mug, a photo from our team's last legitimate success. Everything else, every note, every diagram, every shortcut I'd created to make our systems run smoothly, stayed locked in my head. Derek stopped by as I was leaving, flanked by 2 of his new hires, kids who thought Kubernetes was revolutionary and had never debugged assembly code at 3 a.m. No hard feelings. "Maya," he said, extending his hand, "you'll land somewhere great, maybe a smaller company, more your speed." I shook his hand, feeling the soft grip of someone who'd never pulled cable through server racks. Good luck with Operation Phoenix. His eyes lit up. Monday's kickoff is going to be legendary. We're calling it Velocity First, Excellence Always. Already got the deck ready. 120 slides of pure transformation. Behind him, his disciples nodded enthusiastically. One was actually taking notes. I walked out of Altaris Dynamics at 4:30 p.m., 18 years of institutional knowledge leaving with me. My phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, but I didn't respond. The most powerful weapon in my arsenal wasn't what I could say. It was what I wouldn't. Monday arrived with Derek's much-anticipated all-hands meeting. Tina sent me screenshots throughout the day, each one more absurd than the last. Derek's presentation was a masterpiece of corporate buzzword. Bingo synergize cross-functional capabilities. Leverage cloud-forward momentum. Activate our innovation DNA. He announced that the old infrastructure team had been liberated to pursue other opportunities, and that his new Phoenix Squad would deliver twice the results in half the time. The Phoenix Squad consisted of 12 people he'd recruited from LinkedIn. Their profiles were impressive if you didn't know what to look for. Lots of certificates, bootcamp graduations, Medium articles about 10x engineering. Not one of them had ever managed a production database failure at 2 a.m. or understood why our specific load balancers were configured the way they were. Derek dismantled our careful redundancies, calling them legacy overhead. He restructured the deployment pipeline to be agile first, which meant removing what he called unnecessary checkpoints, what we called critical safety validations. He assigned the new team to begin the Phoenix migration immediately, confident that enthusiasm could replace expertise. I sat in my apartment, laptop closed, phone on silent, no warnings, no friendly heads up about the missing documentation, no mention of Clause 7.3c. I simply ceased to exist in their system, which was exactly what I wanted. Wednesday. Tina texted, "They can't find the migration scripts." Of course they couldn't. The scripts were there. But without understanding the logic tree, they were like having a recipe in a language you couldn't read. Derek's team tried reverse engineering my code, but I'd written it in a way that was elegant to execute, impossible to decipher without the architectural map, the one locked behind my authorization. Thursday. Derek's bringing in consultants. 3 McKinsey associates arrived, took one look at the codebase, and recommended a ground-up rebuild. Estimated timeline 18 months, estimated cost $32 million. Derek's face, according to Tina, went through several shades of pale. Friday, 1 week after my departure. Emergency architecture review. Derek's sweating through his shirt. He'd promised the board a Monday launch. The investors were expecting Phoenix to go live. The press release was already drafted. Derek had bet everything on his ability to execute without understanding what execution actually required. I opened my laptop for the first time that week, not to intervene, but to watch. The Jenkins dashboard was public-facing, a decision Derek had made to showcase transparency. Every failed build, every crash test, every red alert was visible to anyone who knew where to look. The error logs were poetry, null pointer exceptions, reference failures, dependency conflicts, a cascade of problems that stemmed from one fundamental issue: they were trying to deploy my architecture without my permission, without my keys, without me. Derek could have asked. Even after firing me, he could have negotiated, could have contracted my services, could have shown the humility to admit he needed what I'd built, but that would have meant admitting he'd been wrong. Instead, he chose to believe that code was just typing, that systems were just servers, that everything could be fixed with enough motivational Monday meetings. He was about to learn otherwise. Monday morning, 7 a.m., the Phoenix launch day. I sat in my favorite coffee shop, the one with the worn leather chairs and terrible Wi-Fi that kept the tech bros away. My phone vibrated constantly, former colleagues watching the disaster unfold in real time. Tina's first message came at 7:15. Test environment just went nuclear. Error 5004 everywhere. Error 5004. I knew it intimately. A cascade failure in the data synchronization layer that occurred when someone tried to initialize the migration protocol without the proper authentication sequence. It was like trying to start a car by hot wiring it, except the car was designed to lock down every system if you tried. By 8 a.m., the Phoenix squad was in full panic mode. Screenshots flooded in from multiple sources. The Slack channels were erupting. Derek's new architects were Googling error codes, posting desperate questions on Stack Overflow, trying anything to make the system respond. Critical container orchestration lost. Nodes failing health checks. Warning API gateway returning null on all endpoints. Fatal database connection pool exhausted. The beautiful thing about complex systems is that they fail in complex ways. Each error triggered 3 more. Each fix attempted by Derek's team made things exponentially worse. They were performing surgery with sledgehammers, unable to understand that every component was interconnected in ways their bootcamp training had never covered. At 9:30 a.m., Derek called an emergency war room. According to my sources, he stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, drawing diagrams that meant nothing while barking orders that made even less sense. "Just roll back to the last stable version," he commanded. But there was no stable version. They'd been building on top of my architecture without understanding its foundation. The QA team was collapsing under the pressure. The staging environment was corrupting production data. The sandbox, that carefully isolated testing ground I'd spent months perfecting, was bleeding errors into the live system. Derek had removed the safeguards, calling them unnecessary friction. Now he was watching friction turn into fire. By noon, customers started noticing. The client portal was showing inconsistent data. Transaction logs were duplicating, then vanishing. The support team was drowning in tickets. Derek's grand transformation was becoming a very public nightmare. He tried to maintain control, sending out a company-wide email at 12:45 p.m. Minor hiccups in our revolutionary deployment. The Phoenix squad is handling it with maximum velocity. But velocity without direction is just chaos, and everyone could smell the smoke. The consultants he'd brought in took one look at the deteriorating situation and quietly excused themselves. "Beyond our scope of engagement," they said, which was consultant speak for, "This is about to become a legal nightmare and we want no part of it." At 2 p.m., Derek made his fatal mistake. Instead of stopping, instead of admitting defeat, he pushed harder. He ordered the team to force deploy the migration, to bypass the remaining safety checks, to show some courage and push through. They pushed through. All right, straight through every remaining barrier between functional and catastrophic. The core database, the one containing 7 years of customer data, transaction histories, and critical business intelligence, began throwing integrity errors. Tables were locking, indexes were corrupting, the backup systems, which Derek had optimized by reducing redundancy, couldn't handle the load. 3 p.m. brought the kind of silence that only comes after catastrophic failure. The entire system went dark. Not slow, not degraded, completely, utterly dark. The Phoenix hadn't risen. It had crashed into the mountain and taken everything with it. I finished my 3rd coffee, watching the Jenkins dashboard flatline like a heart monitor in a medical drama. Derek's LinkedIn profile, which I'd been monitoring out of morbid curiosity, still showed his morning post. "Today we soar, Phoenix rising, disrupt, or die." Innovation leader. The irony was perfect. He'd disrupted $71 million worth of infrastructure in less than 8 hours. My phone rang. Carl Dawson. "Maya," he said, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and concern. "You watching this?" "Just having coffee?" "Derek's about to learn what Clause 7.3c means." "Is he?" "Diana's walking to the war room right now with legal. The board called an emergency meeting for 4 p.m. I said nothing, just listened to Carl's steady breathing and the distant sound of panic in his office. "You could have prevented this," he said finally. "So could Derek. All he had to do was ask." Carl Dawson wasn't a man who moved quickly. In his 30 years at Altaris, he'd learned that patience was power, and timing was everything. But when he walked into the war room at 3:30 p.m., his deliberate pace carried the weight of an executioner approaching the scaffold. Derek was mid-sentence, gesticulating wildly at a whiteboard covered in meaningless arrows and boxes. If we just reinitialize the kernel space and— Derek, Carl interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. We need to talk about Clause 7.3c. The room fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to Carl, who stood in the doorway holding a single manila folder, not the 76-page binder, just one folder, one page visible, with highlighting that glowed like a verdict under the fluorescent lights. Not now, Carl, Derek snapped. You're in the middle of a legal violation, Carl said, stepping into the room. Every deployment attempt you've made today, every line of code you've pushed, every migration you've tried to force, it's all unauthorized use of proprietary intellectual property. Derek's face cycled through confusion, irritation, and finally, a flicker of fear. What are you talking about? Carl placed the folder on the table and slid it toward Derek with the same deliberate motion Derek had used to slide that insulting bonus check to me a week ago. The poetry of it wasn't lost on anyone who'd been there. Maya Rodriguez is the registered author of the CloudPath Phoenix Migration Protocol. Every component, every algorithm, every critical function. She registered it 18 months ago under the company's IP innovation program, the one your father signed into policy. Derek picked up the paper, his MBA training finally kicking in enough to recognize legal danger when he saw it. His lips moved as he read, the color draining from his face with each line. But she was an employee, he stammered. Work for hire, company property. Read Section 3, Carl said calmly. Individual Innovation Clause. For breakthrough architectures developed outside standard work product, the author retains control rights. Maya worked nights and weekends on this, on her own time, documented meticulously. Legal approved it, HR stamped it, your father signed it. Diana Hartwell entered the room at 3:45 p.m., flanked by 2 members of the legal team. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was message enough. Compliance had entered the building, and compliance didn't care about your LinkedIn followers or your motivational quotes. Mr. Vaughn, Diana began, her voice carrying the kind of professional detachment that preceded corporate executions. Are you aware that you've attempted to deploy proprietary architecture without authorization? This is ridiculous, Derek said, but his voice cracked. She was fired. She can't just— Employment status doesn't void intellectual property rights, Diana continued. In fact, terminating her without cause while planning to use her registered innovations could be construed as theft of intellectual property. The board has been notified. Carl pulled out his phone and showed Derek something that made the younger man's hands start to shake. It was the commit log from that morning, showing every attempt to bypass the authentication, every forced deployment. Derek's own login credentials authorizing each violation. You documented your own theft, Carl said quietly. Every single attempt is logged, time-stamped, and attributed to your authorization code. The room was beginning to empty. Derek's Phoenix squad, those LinkedIn all-stars who'd been so eager to disrupt and innovate, were quietly gathering their laptops and heading for the exits. They understood the hierarchy of disaster when legal gets involved. Junior staff disappears. She planned this, Derek said, his voice rising. She sabotaged us. No, Carl corrected. She documented her work and protected her intellectual property, as was her right. You fired her and then tried to steal what she created. The only sabotage here was your assumption that enthusiasm could replace expertise. At 3:55 p.m., Derek's phone rang. The caller ID showed his father's direct line. He stared at it for 3 rings before answering. My office? Now. The CEO's voice was audible even from across the table. The call ended in 2 seconds. Derek stood, his slim-fit shirt now dark with sweat, his perfectly styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it. He looked around the war room, at the failed deployment metrics still glowing red on every screen, at the senior staff who wouldn't meet his eyes, at Carl who stood like a monument to institutional knowledge. "This isn't over," Derek said, but even he didn't believe it. Carl watched him leave, then turned to the remaining staff. "Maya Rodriguez's architecture is off-limits without her explicit authorization. Any attempts to access, modify, or deploy it will be reported directly to legal. Is that understood?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Carl picked up his folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked out with the same measured pace he'd entered with. At 4 p.m. sharp, he sent me a single text. "The Foundation remembers its architect." Tuesday morning brought an unexpected ritual. At precisely 9 a.m., Altaris Dynamics held its monthly fire drill, a requirement that couldn't be postponed, not even for a $71 million crisis. The timing was coincidental, or maybe Carl had friends in building management. Either way, 300 employees filed out into the Seattle morning, forming awkward clusters in the parking lot. Derek stood with his Phoenix squad near the loading dock, their usual swagger replaced by the hunched shoulders of the thoroughly defeated. His father, CEO Marcus Vaughn, stood 50 feet away with the board members who'd flown in for the emergency meeting. The distance between them might as well have been measured in light years. That's when Carl did something I'd only heard about later, from 17 different witnesses who all told it the same way. He walked to the center of the parking lot, that same manila folder tucked under his arm, and began to clap. Slow, deliberate. The sound echoed off the glass buildings like a countdown. Clap, clap, clap. People turned. Conversations died. 300 pairs of eyes focused on Carl Dawson, the architect who'd built half their success stories and was now applauding in the middle of a crisis. "Brilliant work, Derek," Carl said, his voice carrying across the lot. "Absolutely brilliant. In 1 week, you've accomplished what competitors have been trying to do for 5 years. You've brought Altaris to its knees." Derek's face flushed red. "Carl, this isn't—" "The time, the place," Carl continued, still clapping with that maddening rhythm. "When is the right time to discuss destroying $71 million of value? When is the right place to talk about firing the architect before stealing their blueprints?" The clapping stopped. Carl held up the folder, and even from across the parking lot, people recognized it. The whispers started immediately. "That's Maya's documentation. The Phoenix architecture." He tried to deploy without her. Clause 73C. The whispers became murmurs. The murmurs became conversations. Every engineer, every developer, every technical staff member who'd been dismissed as lacking energy suddenly understood what had happened. Derek hadn't just failed to launch Phoenix, he'd attempted to steal it. Marcus Vaughn started walking toward his son. Each step measured and terrible. The board members followed like ravens sensing carrion. But Carl wasn't done. "For those wondering why our systems are currently down," Carl announced, his voice now addressing the entire company, "it's because someone decided expertise was optional. Someone thought that ownership meant entitlement. Someone believed that throwing away your foundation wouldn't affect your ability to build." He opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet. Not the legal documentation, but something else. A printout of Derek's Monday morning LinkedIn post. The one about soaring and disruption and innovation leadership. "This," Carl said, holding it up, "is what Derek posted while deploying stolen architecture, while violating IP law, while destroying what Maya Rodriguez spent 18 months building." The silence was absolute. Even the Seattle traffic seemed to pause. Derek stood frozen, his Phoenix squad having somehow melted away, leaving him alone in a circle of empty asphalt. Marcus Vaughn reached his son. Whatever he whispered made Derek's shoulders collapse entirely. Then, louder, for everyone to hear. Inside, boardroom, now. But Carl still wasn't finished. As people began to file back into the building, he called out one more time. "For anyone wondering, Maya Rodriguez's architecture remains her intellectual property. Any company that wants to use it will need to negotiate with her directly. She's no longer bound by any non-compete, thanks to Derek's termination without cause. The implications rippled through the crowd like electricity. I wasn't just protected, I was free. Free to license my architecture to whoever I chose. Free to consult at whatever rate I demanded. Free to watch Altaris realize exactly what they'd thrown away. Tina found Carl as they walked back inside. Did Maya plan this? Carl smiled. That same small smile from a week ago. Maya didn't plan anything. She just documented her work and protected her rights. Derek planned everything else. The firing, the theft, the failure. Maya just didn't stop him. At 9:45 a.m., as employees settled back at their desks, an email went company-wide from the board of directors. Effective immediately, Derek Vaughn has resigned from his position to pursue other opportunities. Carl Dawson will serve as interim CTO while we search for qualified leadership. The last line was the one that mattered. The board is entering negotiations with Maya Rodriguez regarding the licensing of critical infrastructure components. My phone buzzed with the screenshot from Tina, followed by a cascade of messages from former colleagues, but I didn't respond. I was too busy updating my consulting rates. The public humiliation in the parking lot wasn't something I'd planned or even imagined, but Carl understood something Derek never could. In technology, reputation is everything. Derek hadn't just failed. He'd been exposed as a fraud in front of everyone whose respect he'd tried to buy with buzzwords and borrowed authority. The empire hadn't just crumbled. It had been publicly demolished, brick by brick, in a parking lot at 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, with everyone watching. The boardroom at Altaris Dynamics was designed to intimidate. 23rd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a table carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood that cost more than most people's annual salary. I'd been in it exactly once before, during my initial Phoenix presentation. Now, according to Tina's play-by-play texts, it was about to become Derek's professional grave. The board had assembled by 10 a.m., Marcus Vaughn at the head, 5 external directors who represented $300 million in invested capital, and Helen Zhao, the lead investor who'd specifically backed Phoenix based on my architecture. Diana Hartwell sat to the right with legal, Carl to the left with his ever-present folder. Derek entered at 10:05, still trying to project confidence. He'd changed shirts, fixed his hair, and presumably rehearsed whatever spin he was about to attempt. He opened his laptop and pulled up a presentation titled Phoenix Phase 2 Tactical Adjustments. "Thank you for coming," Derek began, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a slight tremor. "I want to address the temporary setback." $71 million, Helen Zhao interrupted. "That's the number my analysts gave me this morning. 71 million in direct losses, not counting reputation damage, customer attrition, or potential lawsuits." Derek clicked to his next slide, a recovery timeline that promised full restoration in 6 weeks. "With the right resources." "You mean with Maya Rodriguez," Helen said. "The architect you fired, the one whose intellectual property you attempted to steal." "That's a mischaracterization." Diana Hartwell opened her laptop and connected it to the room's display. The screen filled with deployment logs, each one time-stamped, each one showing Derek's authorization code attempting to bypass IP protections. 11:43 a.m., attempt to override authentication. 12:15 p.m., forced deployment flagged as unauthorized. 1:37 p.m., manual bypass of security protocols. Should I continue? There are 47 more entries. The board members exchanged glances. Marcus Vaughn hadn't said a word, hadn't even looked at his son. Derek tried to pivot. The architecture was developed on company time. "Wrong," Carl interjected, pulling out a new document. "I have here Maya's time logs. Every critical component was developed outside business hours, nights, weekends, even during her vacation time. She followed protocol, registered her innovation, and retained rights as per your father's own policy." Helen Zhao leaned forward. Derek, are you aware that Maya Rodriguez is currently entertaining offers from 3 of our competitors? The room went cold. Derek's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She can't her non-compete. Was voided when you terminated her without cause. Legal confirmed. She's free to work with anyone, and more importantly, to license her architecture to anyone. Marcus Vaughn finally spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Show them the email. Helen. Helen pulled up her phone and read, From Maya Rodriguez, sent this morning at 8:45 a.m. Ms. Zhao. I'm prepared to license the Phoenix architecture back to Altaris for a one-time fee of $12 million, plus a 2% royalty on all revenue generated by systems utilizing my protocol. This offer expires at 5 p.m. today. $12 million, plus royalties, for architecture I'd built while earning $160,000 a year. That's extortion, Derek exploded. That's market value, Helen corrected. Actually, it's below market value. CloudForge offered her $18 million this morning. The PowerPoint was still frozen on Derek's 6-week recovery plan, a monument to delusion in 12-point font. One board member, a silver-haired woman who'd run tech companies since before Derek was born, finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Mr. Vaughn, did you at any point consider that firing your lead architect before a major deployment might pose a risk? Derek's jaw clenched. I was optimizing our human resources. You were playing CEO, his father said, standing abruptly. You were so busy disrupting that you never stopped to understand what you were disrupting. Marcus walked to the window, his back to the room. The board has already voted. Derek, you're terminated effective immediately. Carl will serve as interim CTO. We'll accept Maya's offer, assuming she's still willing after this. Embarrassment. Dad. Don't, Marcus turned, and for the first time, I heard later, people saw real anger in his eyes. You didn't just fail, Derek. You failed while stealing. You failed while lying. You failed while destroying the very foundation of what we've built. And you did it all with a smile, thinking you were clever. The legal team slid a single document across the table. Derek's termination agreement, including a non-disclosure clause and a 5-year ban from serving in any technology leadership role at a public company. Sign it, Marcus said, or we pursue criminal charges for IP theft. Derek's hand shook as he signed. The pen scratched across paper like fingernails on a coffin. At 10:55 a.m., security escorted Derek Vaughn out of the building he'd entered 7 days ago as the future of Altaris Dynamics. His LinkedIn profile still showed him as CTO. His last post, from 3 hours ago, talked about pushing through adversity. The board approved my licensing terms at 11:30 a.m. Carl called me personally to confirm, his voice carrying something that might have been pride. $12 million, Maya, plus royalties. They accepted everything. I sat in my apartment, looking at the Seattle skyline, at the Space Needle still piercing through the clouds. Structural integrity. Remove the wrong piece, and everything collapses. Derek had removed the wrong piece. Me. The aftermath was quieter than the explosion. Within a week, Altaris Dynamics had hemorrhaged $71 million in direct losses. Customer lawsuits were mounting. 3 major contracts were canceled. The stock price dropped 42% before the markets opened Thursday morning. Derek Vaughn's LinkedIn profile disappeared entirely by Wednesday afternoon. The motivational posts, the thought leadership articles, the carefully curated image of a young executive disrupting the old guard, all of it vanished like smoke. Someone screenshot his last post before it disappeared. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the hardest falls. Excited for my next chapter. Resilience / growth mindset. There was no next chapter. Word travels fast in Seattle's tech community. Within hours of his termination, every major firm knew the story the CEO's son who'd fired his lead architect and tried to steal her code, who'd destroyed a $71 million project in a single morning, who'd been exposed in a parking lot while 300 employees watched. Marcus Vaughn stepped down as CEO 2 weeks later, taking responsibility for what the board delicately called oversight failures in succession planning. He issued one public statement: leadership isn't inherited, it's earned through competence, integrity, and respect for the people who build your success. Carl Dawson served as interim CTO for exactly 30 days, long enough to stabilize the systems, restore basic functionality, and implement my architecture properly under the licensing agreement. Then he retired, as he'd been planning to do before Derek's disaster forced him to stay. His farewell email was 2 sentences: "The foundation is secure. Remember who built it." Diana Hartwell was promoted to Chief Compliance Officer with a direct report to the board. Her first act was to strengthen the IP protection protocols, making sure no future executive could attempt what Derek had tried. Tina and the rest of the original team were offered their jobs back with 20% raises. Most accepted. They knew the value of working with systems that actually functioned, built by people who actually understood them. As for me, I never returned to Altaris Dynamics as an employee. Instead, I founded Rodriguez Systems Architecture, a consulting firm specializing in complex infrastructure design. My first client was Altaris, paying those licensing fees. My second was CloudForge, one of their competitors. My third was a startup that just wanted to build things right from the beginning. The $12 million from Altaris went partly to a house with a view of the Sound, partly to an investment portfolio, and partly to a scholarship fund at MIT for women in systems engineering. I named it the Clause 7.3c Foundation, a reminder that knowing your rights is just as important as knowing your code. 6 months later, I received an unexpected email. It was from Derek Vaughn, writing from a personal Gmail account. The subject line read, "You were right." The message was short. I thought leadership was about vision and energy. I never understood it was about respecting the people who turn vision into reality. I'm sorry for what I did. You deserved better. The company deserved better. I hope your success continues. I didn't reply. Some bridges, once burned, illuminate more by their absence than their presence ever did. A year after that morning when Derek slid that insulting bonus check across the table, I was invited to speak at a tech conference about infrastructure design. The organizer introduced me as the architect who proved that the most powerful code isn't always the code you write. Sometimes it's the code you refuse to let others steal. The audience laughed. I didn't, because I knew the truth. I hadn't planned some elaborate revenge. I'd simply documented my work, protected my rights, and when Derek decided to dispose of me like obsolete hardware, I let him discover what happens when you remove the cornerstone of your architecture. The building doesn't collapse dramatically. It doesn't explode in flames. It simply stops working. And in technology, in a world that runs on systems and code and the invisible infrastructure beneath the surface, stopping is the most catastrophic failure of all. Derek thought he was cutting costs by firing me. Instead, he'd cut his own throat with a keyboard, one keystroke at a time. The last I heard, he was working as a project manager at a mid-sized firm in Portland, reporting to a technical lead who was 23 years old and actually knew how to code. His LinkedIn profile, rebuilt from scratch, no longer mentioned disruption or transformation. His bio simply read, "Learning every day." Perhaps he finally was. My name is Maya Rodriguez. I didn't destroy a $71 million empire out of anger or revenge. I simply refused to save it after they threw me away. Sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't retaliation. It's letting people face the consequences of their own arrogance. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's the best code you'll ever write, the code that executes itself. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment, and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of corporate karma and technical justice, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation where expertise was undervalued until it was too late? I'd love to hear your stories.